So last time we looked at a paradox that Parfit raises while thinking about Thomson's objection to mind theory. And the paradox says this: when we duplicate Brown's mind, destroy Brown's body, and stick Brown's mind in Purple's body, and also stick Brown's mind in Red's body, it looks like there's only three options for what we say about Brown's survival. One is that Brown didn't survive the procedure, despite the fact that Purple and Red each claim to be Brown and are mentally the same and so on. It was death for Brown to go through this operation. Another possibility is that Brown survives as Purple or as Red, but not as both. And another possibility is that Brown survives as both Purple and Red. Well, we considered reasons against each of these options. That is, it seems like there's good reason to say Brown did survive, there's good reason to say Brown didn't survive as just one of them, and there's good reason to say that Brown didn't survive as both. So we have reason to reject each option, but the options are mutually exhaustive, so we have to accept at least one. And that's the paradox. I suggested you could think about how to resolve this paradox, and in this segment we'll consider how Parfit resolves the paradox. Here's what he says. He says that in fact, Brown survives in both Purple's body and Red's body. So Brown is wholly located, that is, the entire person Brown is in Purple's body. And Brown is wholly located, that is, the entire person Brown is in Red's body. In each of these two bodies, each of these two people is entirely Brown. Okay, so if we're going to say that, we have to revisit the argument that was given against saying that Brown survives as both. And here was the argument. Premise 2, notice premise 1 was left off. There's a reason for that, which will be coming. Premise 2 says if Brown survives in Purple's body, or as the person that is Purple, then Brown is identical with the person in Purple's body. That is, Brown is identical with the person that is Purple. And if Brown survives in Red's body, then Brown is identical with the person in Red's body. But of course, the person in Red's body and the person in Purple's body aren't identical with one another, which by the transitivity of identity they would have to be if Brown was identical with each of them. So it follows that Brown doesn't survive as both of these people. And that was the case against option 3. Well, Parfit asks us to consider why anyone would accept 2. That is, why you would think that survival requires identity. That's the assumption underlying 2, right? Why is it that if Brown survives in Purple's body, then Brown must be identical with the person in Purple's body? Because survival requires identity. What it is for me to be the same person as the person who started this class a few months ago is for me to be the same person, literally the same, meaning identical with, numerically identical with, the same exact individual. And it's natural to think this way about survival. We talk this way all the time. I don't say, I am a descendant of the person to whom my mother gave birth, in 1974. I say, I am the same person as the person to whom my mother gave birth in 1974. Of course, I have many different qualities. I've changed I've grown quite a bit. I'm taller, I have more hair. I can think much more clearly. I understand the world much better, and so on and so forth. My mind and my body have changed quite a bit. But despite these changes, I'm the same individual. I'm not some distinct individual that has replaced the previous individuals. I'm the same person. It's a natural way to think. So it's rather natural to think that survival requires identity. And if you accept that survival requires identity, then premise 2 follows. If Brown survives as either of these people, then Brown is identical with whichever he survives as. If he survives as both, then he's identical with both. Well, this claim that survival requires identity, however natural it may seem, is the claim that Parfit will reject. So he asks why anybody would accept that survival requires identity. And here's an argument. If survival doesn't require identity, then discussions of survival aren't very interesting. They have little to do with discussions of personal identity. Notice that that's the very topic that we're covering, personal identity. We're not talking about personal survival. We're talking about what it is to be the same person as, not what it is to be related in some other way to a person. Well, says Parfit, questions of survival are interesting. So we have two premises. One, if survival doesn't require identity, then discussions of survival aren't really of interest. They're not what we're after when we're talking about personal identity. Two, questions of survival are interesting. They are what we're after when we're talking about personal identity. Therefore, survival requires identity. So Parfit thinks that this kind of reasoning is what motivates one. Now, there's a variety of ways you can fill out these premises labeled 1a and 1b here. But here's one sample way, which we'll come back to a few times throughout while we're talking about Parfit. Suppose that survival doesn't require identity. Then, it seems, survival is divorced from moral responsibility. So why am I responsible for, I don't know, if you email me and ask me to fix a mistake in the gradebook, and then a week later I do it, or I didn't do it, let's say. Why am I responsible for failing to do it? Because I'm the same person who said I would do it. I'm the same person who took on the responsibility of getting the gradebook straight. Now suppose I'm not the same person. Well, then why am I responsible? It seems like I'm not. So discussions of responsibility, it seems, seem to presuppose identity. And those are central to discussions of personal identity. So you might think survival requires identity. Okay, let's consider what Parfit says about this argument. So he's going to say that premise 1a is false. He says maybe some questions that are asked during discussions of personal identity really are questions about identity, that is, the relation of numerical identity literally being the same individual as. But, he says, many questions that are asked under the label personal identity are questions only about some weaker relation, something weaker than survival, something that's not as demanding. And that weaker relation is sufficient for survival. And then he says, let's consider an example. Now he's going to consider a version of the moral responsibility example that I just discussed, but he's going to cut in the opposite direction. So here's the example. We have a person, call her Blue here, and she says, all right, Brown, you owe me $100. I want it by next week. And let's suppose it's a legitimate debt that Brown has incurred. And now we have our evil scientist who then is going to perform the experiment that we just talked about before, where she duplicates Brown's mentality and sticks it in Purple's body and Red's body and destroys Brown's body, and then asks each who they are, and they say each claims to be Brown and have the same memories and so on and so forth. Now along comes Blue and says to the person in Purple's body, upon recognizing that this is really Brown, all right, I want my money. And Purple goes to distribute the money to Blue. Says, okay, here it is. And then says, wait a second, what's this? And along comes Red. And Red says, I'm Brown. I want what I used to want, and so on and so forth. Now the question is, what is the correct reaction from everyone? Who owes Brown the $100? Or sorry, who owes Blue the $100? Now imagine Purple reasons like this. The scientists must have made 2 copies of Brown. Well, survival requires identity. You and I, Red, are not identical with one another. Identity is transitive. So if Brown is identical with me and Brown is identical with you, then we must be identical with each other. So it follows that Brown is not identical with at least one of us. And each of us has equal claim to being identical with Brown, so it follows that Brown is not identical with either of us. Well, since Brown is not identical with either of us, it follows that neither of us owes Blue any money. And that seems like a really strange result. Blue might say, wait, no, you each owe me $100, or maybe each of you owes me 50, or something like this. There's different ways Blue might react. But what's strikingly odd is for this to be true, that Purple did owe Blue $100 until Red showed up on the scene, and then nobody owes Blue anything. This is related to the double success can't be a failure, which we mentioned last time. Now, Blue, you can imagine, will say this. Look, I think your mistake is that survival doesn't require identity. Purple, you can be the survivor of Brown, and Red, you can be the survivor of Brown, even though you're not identical with one another, and therefore at least one of you, and therefore both of you, neither of you is identical with Brown. And, says Blue, we can obviously talk about personal responsibility even if we give up on identity. So even if we say, Purple, you're not literally identical with, that is, you're not literally the same individual as the individual from whom I borrowed the money, we can still say because you are appropriately related to that person, because you are the descendant of that person, the survivor of that person, you have to pay me the debt. So here's the lesson. It's of course true that people don't branch as a matter of fact. I should say that these cases we're describing are called fission cases, like nuclear fission. You split the nucleus, you split the atom into two. Uh, into Here you split an individual into two. Okay, so people may not branch, or there may be no fission as a matter of fact. Nonetheless, considering this case has taught us an important lesson: that survival doesn't need to be all or none. It doesn't need to be a matter of identity. It can be a matter of degree. Now, why are we shifting from it's not identity to it can be a matter of degree? Because identity is an all or none relation. You can't be more or less identical with someone. You're either identical with them or you're not. But you can be more or less similar to someone. Similarity is a matter of degree. And Parfit's idea goes, considering this kind of fanciful case has taught us that survival doesn't require identity, which opens up the possibility that survival is a matter of degree. This is really important, he thinks. Why? Well, explaining why requires exploring Parfit's theory, and we're going to leave that theory for next time. So we'll stop there and start with Parfit's theory next time.